Feels like a long time since I've done a news video. We got a bunch of articles to talk about today. However, I think I want to start out with we have the RTX 5050 getting some leaked specs. To be clear, this is still in the leaks and rumor category, so maybe it's got a 50-50 chance of being right, but it is coming from mega-sized GPU, which has got some things accurately in the past. And then we have videocards.com. All my sources will be linked in the video description, putting together this helpful chart. The main new thing we're getting here that hadn't been rumored previously is that the RTX 5050 will have 20 gigabit per second GDDR6 memory, as opposed to the rest of the 50 series lineup, which is using GDDR7 memory. Now, this would still put the memory faster than the RTX 4060, which had 17 gigabit per second GDDR6, and I believe the 20 gigabit per second memory puts it in line with the memory being used in AMD's RX 9000 series. Now, this is certainly interesting. That would be a cutback compared to the rest of the series, but what I would hope is that this means the cost is lower on the memory, and that this would help this card be affordable. We'll have to see. I mean, NVIDIA likes their profit margins, but again, we'll have to see how this plays out. In CUDA core count, the rumors are placing it at 2,560, which is 2/3 of the RTX 5060, which has 3,840. And this also puts it below the RTX 4060. I don't think the slightly faster memory compared to the 4060 would make up for that. And we haven't seen the cores for the 50 series providing a lot more performance than the cores from the 40 series. In fact, it doesn't seem like they necessarily core for core provide any real uplift, and the other uplifts come from elsewhere, things like the increased memory bandwidth or whether it has a larger cache or something like that. So in other words, it looks like the 5050 specs-wise may not be more powerful than a 4060. So I don't know. We'll have to see where this is priced to figure out whether this is, an exciting budget card. Because again, okay, 8 gigabytes of VRAM, obviously been making a lot of fuss about this, but it's one thing to be talking about 8 gigabytes of VRAM on a card that starts at $300 or even is closer to $400. If the RTX 5050 was priced low enough, if we're talking like $199, well then that's something where, okay, turning down some settings to fit in your 8 gigabyte VRAM buffer, or this is just a budget esports card, that starts to make more sense. So pricing, again, will be everything on this, but again, this is all rumored specs anyway. Now, what's going on from Team Red? Well, it seems like you may want to take a look at whether the 9070 XT you're buying has sourced its GDDR6 memory from Samsung or SK Hynix. Well, honestly, it probably doesn't end up being that big of a deal, but because they do have the two different memory suppliers, it looks like AMD has actually confirmed, and it has been tested very thoroughly, that the Samsung modules have looser timings, and then that can lead to slightly less performance. But we're talking in the 2% or so at worst difference, and this is in synthetic benchmarks. It looks like the Bilibili tester was using Speedway from 3D Mark for testing, and it's possible that actual gaming performance could maybe even show less of a difference here. This is from 51972 on Bilibili. I believe that is the name, but again, I'm getting this from Tom's Hardware. Again, all my sources will be linked in the video description. So a little bit annoying, but 1 to 2% variation, maybe not the absolute end of the world. We are talking about generally when you're just buying different cooler models from companies, there can be a 1 to 2% performance difference based on clock speeds and factory overclocks and whatnot anyway, but still is something to be aware of. Now, what about from Team Blue? Well, we are seeing that Intel has officially discontinued the Arc A750 and A770 Alchemist GPUs. This is the A series cards, not the B series cards. So that means they'll stop taking orders for the A750 this month, so eventually you'll start seeing the A-series cards drying up in retail availability as the GPUs that have been ordered now go into production, sell out, and then they are gone. But there's been a lot of question marks on, are we going to get a B750 or a B770? Because currently we just have the B570 and 580, which are the lower tier naming scheme wise. Well, we do now see yet another sign that it's possibly coming, with Intel confirming a BGM G31 Battlemage GPU with 4 variants in a Mesa update, finding this reported by videocards.com. And you can see that here in this screenshot in Mesa. And so what does that tell us? So it looks like this. So if this is an Intel Arc B770, we've seen previous leaks stating that this could be a 32 XC2 core variation. Compared to the Intel Arc B580, that is only a 20 XC2 core variant, and the B570 is 18. We don't know a lot else about it other than we've seen the PCIe interface being listed as 5.0 by 16 as opposed to 4.0 by 8 like we saw on the B580 and B570s. But again, we don't know if this is actually going to get released as a gaming product. We'll have to see what happens. Because there are some question marks about the viability of Intel doing a higher end gaming GPU right now. Questions raised mostly around the fact that the B580 is can see some CPU limitation at lower frame rate numbers than its AMD and NVIDIA counterparts due to CPU driver overhead. And the thing about CPU limited performance is the higher your frame rate goes, the faster your GPU can go, the more likely you are to start hitting a CPU limitation. So think about it like this. Let's imagine a hypothetical game where your NVIDIA GPU driver or your AMD GPU driver has a little bit of CPU overhead, but maybe the CPU is capable of reaching around 100 frames per second. But due to Intel having a higher driver overhead, maybe the CPU, because of that additional overhead, can only produce about 80 frames per second. But if you're talking about an Intel Arc B580, maybe that GPU is only reaching 60 or 70 FPS. So maybe you don't actually see the downside of that additional CPU overhead. But let's say a theoretical B770 is more powerful and it could have reached, let's say, 110, 120 FPS in this game. Except for the fact that then the additional CPU overhead would bring it down to that 80 FPS, because now you're limited, whereas the AMD or NVIDIA competitors can maybe reach 100 FPS before hitting that CPU limit. Again, this is a hypothetical example, but this brings up the idea behind one potential problem with a more powerful Battlemage GPU. The more powerful the GPU is, the more likely you are to reach the frame rates where the CPU becomes the limit. And currently, Intel is reaching those limits at a lower frame rate number than AMD or NVIDIA are. That's kind of raises that question mark. We've also seen, I didn't pull up the article here, Intel's new CEO talking about canceling or at least not greenlighting any new projects that don't have at least 50% gross margin. Now, my understanding of business is maybe not complete, but I believe a gross margin would not include the research and development costs, which could, because I've seen some people saying that this means that Battlemage is going to get canceled, just Arc GPUs in general are going to get canceled because their profit margins aren't there. But again, I don't think gross margins are taking into account the R&D cost, but it could affect the actual, purchasing of the silicon, putting all of this together. And honestly, the Arc B580 was mostly exciting due to its aggressive MSRP at $249. But I'm not sure they've got a 50% gross margin on that $249 price point, right? So a B770, even if it was performant, if you have maybe a less aggressive pricing due to those gross margin targets from Intel, and then again, if you start to see those CPU overhead issues more apparent on a more powerful card, it does bring into question the viability of this product. So I'm very much hopeful that we continue to get Intel competing with Arc GPUs, you need multiple generations to get there and to be competitive. And their progress on this, I think, has been honestly extremely impressive, going from their initial Arc Alchemist launch to its massive improvements over time with its drivers, and then with the Battlemage launch being pretty successful, although not perfect. I don't want them to give up on this. But, like I said, there are still some question marks about its viability and Intel's margin targets. I hope they see the fact that they need, if they're going to be competing on APUs at least, integrated graphics, all of that, that there's already a bunch of R&D costs associated with those graphics, which hopefully it just makes sense to also ship out some gaming GPUs and maybe eventually build into something that is pretty competitive. So I hope they stick with it. Now, moving into more CPU-related news, we do have AMD launching another AM4 processor. That's right, another Ryzen 5000 series product, and this is another X3D chip. This is pretty interesting. This is the Ryzen 5 5500 X3D, which should make it the most affordable, hopefully, X3D CPU on the AM4 platform. However, most of my viewers are going to be disappointed when we see that it's reported as being for Latin America. If you look at the actual listing, it says regional availability, Latin America. So hopefully maybe that expands more globally. And what is the difference between this and the other 6-core X3D variant for the AM4 platform, the 5600 X3D? Well, the 5600 X3D was a Micro Center US exclusive. I don't think it ever expanded beyond that, and this one looks to be clocked lower. And then it's more of a regional variant now, it looks like, with Latin America. So what this can be is, I think maybe as they build up these defective chips that just can't quite meet the specs of the better chip, you can, if you build up enough of them, I think release them as some sort of cut down product. But maybe you just don't have enough to justify a global launch. That's probably what we're seeing here. But anyway, if you're in a region where this is available and the price ends up right, this could be an interesting upgrade for an AM4 build, because I have a feeling this would still be very, very competitive. It's still going to be a lot faster than what you see in like a PlayStation 5, something like that. So I think at least until the next console generation, something like this would be potentially something pretty interesting in a budget build, again, if the price is right. Now, what about Apple in the gaming situation, though? Is your next gaming PC going to be a MacBook? Every now and then we see some signs that Apple is getting a little more serious about gaming on their Macs. But then sometimes they kind of back off from that and it never really goes anywhere, gets all that exciting. However, we are seeing Apple's new M4 Max-powered MacBook Pro demonstrating Cyberpunk 2077, apparently at ultra settings at 120 FPS, but I tried to find if there was more information on the exact graphics settings, but I'm just seeing 120 FPS on ultra settings and that it's apparently coming at some point in 2025. I don't know. We'll have to see what comes of that, but we're also seeing that 3D Mark software is now available natively for Mac OS using Metal API, so perhaps that can at least help us assist with how powerful should a MacBook be at gaming if the games were actually optimized or natively available for it. Perhaps this could at least start giving us another way to compare those. Anyway, I would be interested in various competitors to Windows. We've been seeing a lot going on with SteamOS and all of that competing with it, which actually brings up an interesting point. So we have seen the ROG Xbox Ally being announced. And honestly, the hardware itself, okay, interesting, whatever. But what I'm most interested here is the discussions they've had regarding optimized Windows 11 for handheld gaming. And I'd like this to go beyond just handheld gaming, but perhaps just gaming in general, reduce some of the general overhead, as well as making a Windows gaming PC maybe fit better as a console alternative in a TV environment, because I would love to have, like on my TV in my living room, have a gaming PC that I can just turn on with a controller that boots directly into a controller gaming focused overlay and then just works, right? That seems to be what this is designed to do. But specifically in the handheld space. So what I'm really most excited about with all of this is the tweaks to the operating system. I'm thinking that maybe Microsoft is finally getting a little bit scared of SteamOS becoming just a hands down better in every way gaming operating system, and it's free. SteamOS still has some work to do regarding as much Windows has a lot of like compatibility with all sorts of hardware and games and etc. But SteamOS has just been steadily improving in Linux gaming in general in certain builds. So that's pretty interesting. Also along the lines, though, the original plan seemed to be that there's these third-party but Xbox-branded handhelds, but that Microsoft would be making their own first-party handheld. We're starting to see some rumors, it's not official, because, I mean, I don't think the thing was ever even officially announced, that Microsoft may be abandoning the idea of their first-party Xbox handheld, at least for now, and might just go with these third-party OEM Xbox consoles like this Xbox Ally. Now, again, that is not completely official, but we'll have to, see what comes out of any of this specifically. It is certainly looking like the handheld market is still hot. We've seen the Nintendo Switch 2 selling 3.5 million units in its first 4 days, which does outpace the original Switch launch. However, I think a lot of that has to do with one thing Nintendo seemed to do is actually produce a ton of supply so that if people wanted to buy one, it wasn't impossible to do so, and it was harder for scalpers to buy up the entire supply and then just relist them at ridiculous pricing. Not that there aren't still scalpers out there trying to do so, but I think, again, how many units can you sell in your first 4 days? Well, how many have you produced, right? The Switch 1 was initially, I think, being scalped for quite a while. So how many could they have sold if they had had that much supply available? That's always something to think about. But the handheld market is certainly hot. So we'll have to see what comes of all of this. It's certainly looking like PlayStation is also interested in getting into this. I think they've seen a surprising level of success with their streaming handheld PlayStation Portal, which, in my opinion, was a little bit like, well, you're spending quite a bit for something that doesn't actually natively run stuff. So what about an actual PlayStation handheld? I mean, I had a PSP as a kid and I loved it. But anyway, PlayStation handheld to feature AI upscaling, 16 gigabyte LPDDR5X RAM and 16 megabytes MALL to offset lower memory bandwidth compared to base PS5. However, this is just a rumor. I'm seeing this reported by WCCF Tech. However, they seem to be getting their information from Kepler L2, who does leak a lot of AMD stuff often accurately. Though I don't think it's a 100% track record. Although when leaks come out wrong, is it because something changed? Changed plans behind the scenes, right? Versus it just having been bad information. We'll have to see. And apparently this was on the NeoGAF forum. So that's currently in rumored territory, but it certainly looks like there's a lot of interest in handheld PC situations. Now, speaking of PlayStation, though, I just have to comment on this. So there's been a lot of talk regarding PlayStation's commitment to developing a ton of live service titles and how they saw a big hit with Helldivers 2, but that there was just an epic fail with Concord. We're starting to see PlayStation discussing this, and they said that Concord was insufficiently differentiated. Now, insufficiently differentiated. Okay, what does that even mean? I guess they said it's a crowded space and it's hard to stand out. There's a big quote here, but it was that the title entered a hyper-competitive segment of the market. I think it was insufficiently differentiated to be able to resonate with players. We have reviewed our processes to ensure that we're not going to make those mistakes again. We have introduced much more rigorous processes for validating our creative, commercial, and development assumptions, and we now do that on a much more ongoing basis. Anyway, so they're gearing up for launching Marathon, which we'll have to see how that goes. I know it's certainly had a lot of negativity surrounding it in lead up to launch, but we'll have to see what comes of it. However, if we move away from the multiplayer stuff and move into single-player stuff, we do have Stellar Blade on PC, more than doubling Sony's previous Steam concurrent player count record for single-player games specifically. So Helldivers 2, that's a multiplayer-focused title, right? But Stellar Blade seems to be having a huge PC release, and it's pretty well optimized. I tested out the demo on my channel, and it was running extremely well. By the way, I have to mention that I think it helps to have that demo so that people can see, wow, this game actually runs really well, and then people can then buy it confidently. So I think it was a smart move to have that demo available and drum up some hype regarding the optimization. And then that might be a good time to mention the opposite of optimization. Now, I have not tested this out, but I think enough testing has already taken place for me to say that seems like the Mindseye launch has been the opposite of the Stellar Blade launch on PC, which is an unmitigated disaster with horrifying glitches and poor PC performance and not super great player count numbers or user reviews. So that's looking a little bit rough. Now, the last thing I want to mention is that AMD is adding additional FSR4 support for some new games and fixing some other various issues with their latest Adrenalin 25.6.2 driver release. Looks like specifically we're getting new game support for the Alters and FBC Firebreak, as well as FSR4 support added for the Alters, Delta Force, Dragonkin, The Banished, Roadcraft. And there is a complete list of FSR4 games available. The list is expanding, but I'd like to see it expand just like as fast as possible. By the way, a lot of people are asking me about doing some sort of Optiscaler review on the channel, and I would say that is something I am interested in. I'll need to find the time when exactly I'm going to have time to do the thorough testing of that, but I'm hoping to get that out fairly soon. We'll have to see, because that is a good way to add FSR4 into games that don't support it. Hopefully you guys found today's news roundup video useful and or interesting. If you're interested in more videos like this or the in-depth GPU testing, head-to-heads, all of that, stay tuned to the channel. Huge thank you to viewers, subscribers, channel members who click the join button to directly support the channel financially. Thank you so much, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.